Hi, Michael, Cam, gentlemen. We are back on the saddle here. This session, we are going to be discussing episode number 21, Martin Luther and Descartes, and episode number 22 on Descartes and Hobbes of the John Vervaeke series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And very excited because we are now getting into the thick of it, right? So And if I may just simply start by saying, I have not read primary work or any work of either Luther or Hobbes or Descartes. So my knowledge of these characters and their views is fairly limited. And I was exposed to it primarily as I was listening to Vervaeke's lectures. So that's my opening caveat if I go off the reservation and make some remarks that are completely outside.
Well, I'm not much more educated than you either, as well. I mean, I knew who the names and I knew more about Descartes than the rest of them,
Okay.
but not, I never read a whole book about him or anything else. Um,
How about you,
yeah.
Ken?
Pretty uneducated. I know the names. I know some of the fundamental arguments. It's mostly I learned a lot just by listening to
Yeah.
Vervaeke breaking down the correspondence between them, between Hobbes and Descartes specifically.
Yep.
So let's start with the session 21, Martin Luther and Descartes. Either one of you want to frame the issue or at least first observations?
Yeah, I don't mind starting. One of the things that, I mean, I have to tell you that I'm just so excited to be at this point, this inflection point, because he's building up to this. And especially because of what he's framing here, is explaining the mess we're in now, right? So that's I've heard other people talk about this, but they didn't give you the what do you call it? They didn't give you the detailed history of exactly how we ended up where we are. So that to me is really interesting. Um, and I didn't. It's not like I knew nothing about Martin Luther, but I think that Vervaeke's interpretation of Martin Luther's thought process is very fascinating. And it's too bad I don't know more because I don't really have a way to argue against anything that he says or agree, just that the way he frames it seems relevant to what we're seeing now. So let's see. So basically what I understand about what he's saying in this one is he shows this profound shift of the understanding of reality, the self and meaning, which is instigated by the scientific revolution, right? That's Copernicus and Galileo, who in previous lectures were the ones that put forth these new ways of defining what reality is based on mathematics rather than other forms of framing that reality in the past. And then that influenced Martin Luther and Descartes, which then made changes like saying reality is just calculation. And then Martin Luther interpreting Augustine and Paul, right, in such a way that he says that this part's a little, I actually tried to work this out before we met. It's a bit confusing to me, the way that the faith is framed from Martin Luther. It actually makes me understand why some people think religious people are crazy because it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I keep reading over it and like it seems almost like circular logic to me. Maybe it is, maybe that's the problem. But then that led to a narcissistic view of oneself. As Vervaeke says, the cultural grammar of narcissism, which is fostering social obsessed seeking of unearned positive regard, which he kind of relates that to how people look for unearned regard on social media and in modern culture, which I think is very relevant. And then the Protestant Reformation has a number of consequences, which he says narcissism, fragmentation of Christianity into different denominations. And then, let's see, Descartes creates the graph, which I thought was, I didn't know he did that. That was really interesting. And that computation is, let's see here, that cognition is purely computational, which is an absolutely absurd thing to say, but I guess that's what they believe. And that led to the idea of artificial intelligence as being a potential, and that they had certain devices that actually did calculations in that way. I had no idea it started that far back. And then, of course, all this leads to an existential consequences of a crisis, really, because people don't know. My interpretation is people don't know how to orient, and they don't have the tools to orient and transform their framing anymore. Something like that. What do you guys think? You want to fill in on that? But that was my kind of take.
Good takeaway. Cam?
Oh, well, I want to pick up in the last thing that you said, I think having to do with orientation, that people are disoriented. And he uses the term sapiential a lot. What does that mean to you guys?
Well, I looked it up because I had no idea what that meant, but I think what it means is sapiential is something that used to be used to a cultural way of being that has been discarded or is considered outdated, I think is what I came across, something like that.
The root is Homo sapiens, like sapien, the wise one, right?
Let's see. Let me see. As a consequence,
what it sounds like. When I just look it up, I get adjective, literary, relating to wisdom.
Wisdom,
right?
yeah.
So that's like obsolescence of knowledge. What he's saying is that people just forgot what it means to have wisdom.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you.
Just
I actually have
culturally and otherwise, people just didn't realize where to go to get wisdom.
That's
because
right.
in the previous traditions, the Greek and Hellenistic and other Roman traditions, you had various philosophical schools which were very much focused on how to live, and philosophy and living were tied together. So the wisdom was how you practiced your life, right? Whereas with Luther, what I took away was this idea that everything is about propositions, and your participation and your perspectival doesn't matter. And at some level, it became narcissistic in the sense it became internal. And what struck me was that the withdrawal of meaning into individual mind, and the idea that individual conscience somehow is the arbiter of meaning about what matters. And therefore, being in touch with reality was being superseded by what my conscience tells me is the right way to go. So it became so much about internal focus and focus on conscience rather than being in grip with the reality or oriented towards reality or transcendence. So that I thought was interesting. And so other thing that was very interesting was that because of that, Luther rejected, according to Vervaeke, that you could go through transformation. So you have to just look inside and look at how you could get meaning. And a lot of it was through negation. So if transcendence is out, institutions like monasteries and religious practices were out, but they were not going to get you there. Instead, he says that it became more about universities and state taking on the role of giving you meaning. So it became more important that you studied the right subjects rather than practice the right things in a monastery. So I think rise of universities and states as institutions that could now give you meaning versus belonging to a practice that gave you meaning. That is how I see role of Luther being described by Vervaeke. And, and part of what's interesting to me was that he ties it to say Enlightenment and Reformation being what Luther was proposing, went hand in hand, because while Enlightenment talked about individual accountability and individual having more agency than before. But Luther doesn't believe this applies to state. So
Mm-hmm.
he believes that the separation of Vervaeke says that separation of state and church happened by the ideas of individuals moving their sacred self into their own selves and withdrawing the church and the sacred to the private. Whereas from political point of view, enlightenment, withdrawing the role to themselves away from the church into, and therefore state becoming the only keeper of that. So that's how it's interesting. Sacred becomes private, and secularization is on the rise. And science and university and state are the repositories of secular wisdom, which
You know,
is a very interesting way of approaching.
yeah, I mean, here's an interesting thing that I want to reflect back about what you just outlined is that, because I heard actually that I've heard a number of people talk about this, Miguel Chris being one of them and Jordan Peterson being the other, where they're explaining that what you say in a statement that for example, I believe in God, that's a propositional statement. It doesn't mean anything because you're not saying you're not participating as someone that believes in God. Like, in other words, what does that mean? Well, it has to affect your behavior, otherwise, and your way of being, your way of attending. Otherwise, it's empty. It's like a hollow statement.
Yeah.
And the other thing that comes to mind, because it's something that has bugged me my whole life, is this idea that you go to an institution to receive the right words to say, rather than learning how to think and figure out and participate with something in an ongoing sort of exploration of understanding that continues, right? So, because this is what I find about universities in the modern world, especially, is that what you're taught to do is regurgitate the right words, rather than to be able to think and express or out of a process of discovery or a process of understanding that isn't necessarily considered right or wrong per se, but is put into the arena of a discussion as an exploration of discovery, right? I mean, I think this is what we've lost, especially recently. I mean, in the current world. Do you guys understand what I'm putting forth there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
No, well, I mean, like in other words, if you go to university these days, they teach you what to think and say, not to how to learn and to figure out. And that's actually totally encompassed also in ideology, which is when you enter an ideology, they're not interested in you thinking. You're supposed to learn the doctrine and repeat it. Right? You're supposed to just bow down to the truth, that the absolute truth that they discovered, that is undeniable and what do you call it? Unchallengeable. And so you're supposed to be a robot that just repeats these ideas. And when you do that, you get instant virtue, rather than what the real process is, which is that struggle that you go through where you say, I wonder what's real. I wonder what's true. I wonder if I'm actually attending to the world properly. And it's something you have to ask yourself all the time, instead of you just do it once. Oh, I know now. The devil, the problem with the world is, fill in the blank. The other religions, the white people, the black people, I mean, you can just fill in the blank and then you're done. You're like, oh, I'm virtuous because I'm on the right side of things and I don't have to work hard towards anything. Anyway, so that's what came up when you said it, and it's also what's been coming up when I read this. I'm like, yeah, this is totally, and also this is a very incredible, detailed discussion of how left brain dominance it was starting to come into play.
Yeah.
And what was this about? Is this 300 years ago? Is that right? 1700s?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Luther was before that, right?
I think so. I think that was 1600s. Let me look it up.
And he says, he brings up a couple of interesting points. He says enlightenment from the secular point of view, the political point of view, reformation from a religious point of view, and capitalism, the rise of commerce.
Right.
Industrial Revolution, early stages. From commercial point of view, all three of these left the individual alone in the universe.
Yeah, isolated and fragmented out
And
of
he
the
said,
connectivity, right? Oh, so Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546.
yeah, so 16th century. So his basic point is, by the time you get to Shakespeare, after Luther, there is all the characters, all the stories are about the agency is left to chance or supernatural events. There is no higher gods or forces in the world of Shakespeare, as an example. And cosmos is cold and a terrifying place, according to how he summarizes it. And therefore, at a societal level, because the meaning is getting unraveled, the mechanisms for making meaning are getting unraveled, you see a lot of existential anxiety rising. That's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then to build on what you were saying, by the time you get to Descartes, he is really as left-brained, according to Ian McGilchrist, as they get, because he's creating the symbolic world of graphing and creating abstract symbols. And he goes all the way to the point where he thinks that is the only truth, and everything else is like not certain. Like only abstractions are certain. Um,
Yeah, you
and
can only determine reality through calculation.
yeah, mathematics, right?
Wow.
And
It's pretty left brain, that's for sure.
yeah, and then
I
right.
didn't quite hear it that way. It's pretty sophisticated, and I don't by any means feel like I got it.
Go
But
ahead.
the his comments back to Hobbes, and this maybe if you want me to hold this until we get
No,
into
no, no, go
22,
for
I
it.
Yeah, go
can.
for it.
But Descartes is the one that talks about the necessity of the normative
Yeah, that's right.
in relation to reasoning, the ought to,
Yeah,
which is not
is
by
to
my
all.
way of, I don't hear that as a left brain dominant thing. I hear that as a comprehending, as a
Well, that
being aware that there is the normal to orient to, and that doesn't originate from a logical process or an apparently logical process.
he does say that, but then he goes on to say, I mean, he's dualistic because he goes on to say that mind and matter are fundamentally separate. So I think it seems like there was some real confusion in him because on one hand, he was advocating for an orientation of normative, purpose, meaning, and normative standards, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, when you separate mind from matter, then you have this rift with the world of existence. And you're isolated within your own little island of your mind by yourself. This is kind of what I got from the reading is that you end up, that's why people are so lonely and confused and disoriented, because in the old thought system, there was this connectivity to all things. Everything was connected in a flow and it all related and it was all meaningful. And all of a sudden that's been shattered. And even though he says this about one thing, then he turns around and says that, mind and matter aren't connected, which, McGilchrist completely disagrees with, by the way, in his writing.
So this is where I think the conundrum, I'm building on what Michael is saying. Conundrum is that he clearly believes that there should be is and ought. But he thinks that matter itself lacks meaning and purpose and cannot give you a normative standard. But truth depends on having a meaning and a purpose. And reasoning depends on having that. But if your reasoning is only computational, then how do you go from material observations and mathematics and build towards a truthful ought? Right? So that jump, because it is entirely, that's the way he says that's the error he could not reconcile. And in his mind, he interestingly said that the anxiety came from either propositional, you needed to have propositional certainty, like compute, here is my propositional logic and I need to have certainty. But the more symbolic it becomes, you can't have that certainty because you psychologically, you have to conform to in order to find truth, you have to conform to some matter in a way that you can explore how it gives meaning. But that is replaced by I have more propositions and more propositions for you to become certain.
Yeah, and it's all disconnected, right? So, I mean, I think that my experience in my life is that if I have a proposition, what I have to do is test it out by using it in reality, right? And if it doesn't work, then I know that that proposition is disconnected from reality. I mean, I'm not, always dead certain, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, that doesn't work, because if that proposition was correct, then I would be able to act in reality with it, and I would get the result that it says I will get. And that's what I think is kind of what's wrong with universities now. It's just all this propositional knowledge without any practical application, and then you can just kind of go into some sort of fantasy world about being right and being told you're right by other intellectuals, but it never lands on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And here is what I took away, paraphrasing John, which I thought, Vervaeke, which I thought was interesting. He says, the notion of certainty was propositional view is logical certainty. Psychological certainty means your inability to have doubt. And he says his basic problem was that he doubted everything, hoping that he will get to have doubt removed through logical certainty.
Mhm.
And he kept going deeper and deeper, and it never got there. And it's interesting. He says, as long as you have that split between mind and matter, and there is no common property or shared way of getting bootstrapping matter into some properties of the mind, those split remains, there's no causal connection. And therefore, it leads to the problem of how you're going to get to the ought. That is, how do you get to something that you care about, if it's all only matter? That's kind of what I took away.
I agree. I think that's really well said. And again, this is Vervaeke, McGilchrist says that the left brain wants certainty even if it's not possible, right? So it's obsessed with certainty and categorization, right? So it can't just say, oh, that's beyond my understanding. It has to force its abstraction onto it so it can feel like it's in control or that it knows.
So I don't know, I'm trying to be polite. I want to challenge that a little bit and
Please.
say, I think I noticed that left hemispherical approach in my own subjective experience of reality. Except it's not obsessed. It can surrender it. It can, it happens practically every day for me, where, because mine goes to work like crazy. Like it gets going in the morning, and the nature of my life, the nature of the work that I do is like I'm hyper categorical all day. I'm categorizing things, parsing the world, and I'm consciously aware that that is the dominant processor. And also relentlessly, I get to somewhere between like 3 and 6 in the afternoon, evening, and it's clear that that part needs to let go. Like it's actually making things worse now. It's reached its limit for the day. It feels like there's too many threads going. And there is a conscious release of it. It doesn't exactly extinguish right away. Sometimes it's quite difficult to let it spin down, allow it to spin down, because it feels like it has an inertia where it cannot help but name things and categorize things and just keep driving away at that. But there is a capacity there for sure, conscious capacity to start to relinquish them.
But that's not the left brain relinquishing, that's the right brain.
Well, but doesn't the left have to let it go? Doesn't it have to say,
No,
I'm I know what I'm doing and I need to, yeah, so I think you and I disagree on that.
that I'm just
I
I'm
think
just going by McGilchrist's model. That's not my model, it's his. And I've accepted it at the moment, at least. He says that left brain is not it's not capable of a consciousness that knows what it doesn't know. It is very, very insular and narcissistic in its view. And so you have to have right brain dominance for that sort of integration that you just said to come into play. The right brain has to be the dominant orientation for that to happen.
so. Why does it need to be a dominance thing though? Why can't it be a cooperation thing?
Well, it is, but he says that there's asymmetry in brain development, brain size, and brain shape, and it's true in all organisms throughout history. And the reason is because he says because you have to have one that is the master and one that does the errands, and the left brain is the errand boy, and the errand boy thinks that it needs to be master is when everything gets all mucked up. But you know, that's his model. I mean, it'd be kind of like this. I think this is a good model. What do you think? Should a child rule the house? Or should an adult be the one that makes the rules and organizes the household and what is correct or not? I think that's a pretty good metaphor.
Thanks for entertaining me on that.
Sure.
So comments
Are we on to number
Descartes,
2 now?
Descartes, and yeah. I think we've covered. I don't have anything else from my notes on the two.
Let me see. Well,
So
go
there
ahead.
was a sequence of deaths that he was going through. Reaching back into the few episodes leading up to these. And it would be helpful, I think, maybe to try to retrace those if you guys.
You mean the transformations that happen as a result of these new orientations?
Well, yeah. So episode 20 is titled "The Death of the Universe," and I think that's you guys talked about that one. That's isn't that the
Yeah.
beginning of the scientific worldview?
Yeah, the splitting of the yeah, exactly. The spiritual from the secular.
And then with Luther,
that split continues.
Yeah, Luther, his ideas accentuate and speed up the split because we can talk a little bit more about that because I have a perspective about this that's really fascinating. When my parents being hippies and into the New Age thought process and Marxism, they had this view that everyone created their own reality and that you couldn't tell anyone else what reality was. And it was extremely toxic because I'll just give you an example. I would say to them, the way you're treating me is not good for me. And they would say, well, that's just your perception. And that if you don't like it, you just have to change your perception about it. It's like, how do you relate to someone like that?
walk
And
away.
that's actually very much the case in postmodernism. Is postmodernism says that everything's a construct within your mind, and that there's no truths. It's all cultural constructs or some sort of construct. Of course, the thing that's so ironic about that is what they're saying is a construct. So it's like
it's self-negating.
Yeah, it's circular reasoning, right? So, but I think that really struck me when I read this. I'm like, God, this is where it started, all the way back here. This sort of the self-referential truth, rather than and by the way, I do believe in that to some degree, which is I think in this sense, which is I think it's important to know to be honest with yourself about what you think is true or what is right, but not assuming that you've got it all figured out. I mean, and so it's not it's not an ultimate proposition. It's just, this is my view from here. That's what I think that's what that they've just that they've mucked up, is that the proposition actually, or the statement is, from where I'm standing and my filters, this is what I see. But then what that is an invitation for someone else to come and give their report, so that then you can you kind of sort out what is most likely correct in the moment about how to move forward in life. It's they stop there and they're just in their little world, you know, and my parents were unbelievably dysfunctional and unsuccessful people. And the only way they felt different about that was creating these constructs in their mind about they were superior spiritually to others. The way they lived was better than those capitalist, greedy people. I mean, God, and, you know, meanwhile, they're, you know, neglecting their children and barely making rent. And I mean, anyway, I could go on, but that did spark something in me, that framing of how this started and how that toxic mold grew through society. And it's even reflected in the transgender movement. Identify. So you don't have to orient towards anything real. You just have to state what you feel without any feedback from the world. Oh, I mean, and I'm not against transgender people. I mean, I've worked on them. I respect that people have different ways of living, but that's problematic to me, highly problematic. Yeah. That you would just say, I can state whatever, you know, identify. I mean, because if you want to push that to its extreme, I could just show up somewhere and say, I identify as a Black, homeless, woman of mixed race, who is, you know, whatever, and then I should get the benefits of that category. Like, yeah, I don't think so. That's not a functional social construct to me.
Yeah. I think we are seeing the limits of the effect of all the ideologies that get untethered, right? And that's from any feedback loop or any loop or contact with reality.
Well, that maybe, you know, I was wondering, because we kind of did this last time, maybe it would be interesting to talk about applications of what we're learning, because we did that a little bit last time. And I thought it was helpful.
Yeah, I like
what do you
that
guys
idea.
think of that?
I like that idea.
I mean, I'm kind of curious, again, I did something that we talked about last time, but I'm curious to ask it again. What sort of shifts and I see even / benefits are you guys perceiving in your life as a result of our conversations and the study of Vervaeke's material? That's kind of what I'm.
Yeah. So let me take a stab at how I'm experiencing this. To me, AFMC, Awakening from Meaning Crisis series is very much about exposing me to the historical trajectory of how meaning was created and lost and recreated and lost in historical terms. It's intellectually edifying, and it actually relieves my anxiety when I look at the crazy things that are happening in the society right now, because I don't view it from the lens of, oh my God, this has never happened before. I look at it and say, you know, we have lost meaning in so many different ways, and we have counter forces that come back, and people find meaning with new and different integration of new and old ideas, as has happened, the seesaw. So in that regard, intellectually, I find it comforting, this historical lens, and continuing to see how that evolved. Second point is that what I thought was only good ideas, such as enlightenment, such as progress coming from Copernicus revolution, or such as the Hellenistic era. What I'm discovering is that loss of meaning can happen from both sides, what I thought was the right side of history and the wrong side of history. Because many of the examples he's giving is basically, you know, things that were that created meaning in the material progress and meaning in some direction, and then went beyond its limits and created unintended consequences. There's no way you can argue that enlightenment and a scientific worldview was not good. Of course, it was.
No.
Right? We would not have the flourishing of last 500 years, but it did result in loss of quote unquote death of God or the religion as it was practiced, and now we are feeling the emptiness of it and the consequence of it. So I found those two facts: one, historical aperture, and second, that it's an intertwined positive negative forces, and the meaning gets lost and created, even with good and bad, so-called good and bad movements of history. So that is also satisfying to me. So when I apply to today, I'm hoping and I'm practicing that I maintain a little bit of distance from the political fights and the political wars that are happening. Many of them you mentioned, Michael, and some others that might used to trigger me a lot more. Now I just say, this is how it's gonna be. We are going through a transition period where our old frameworks of making meaning are going to get collapsed, and it might be a generation long after I'm gone for it to resort to something better, or perhaps even continue for worse. The timeframes of these shifts are longer than a generation sometimes. So I take comfort in that and say, at least I now can see how the meaning making is happening or not happening. And as an observer, I can now detach myself and not get all worked up in it, right? So even if I vehemently disagree with the nonsense of that's happening right now, I can just give it some distance. And over there, I can tell you, I am looking for toolkits. So this is not my selfish project. This is my personal project. So, and that is not to do with John Vervaeke's meaningful series. It is, I am now stepping out and saying, okay, selfishly, if I'm convinced that the meaning is not going to come from a particular single place or source, then what is my mashup? What is my mixture of practices? So all four practices, participatory, what I want to become, and propositional ideas also that I was holding, I need to let go. So I need to go up and down the 4 Ps of propositional, 4 Ps of cognition. 4 Es of cognition and the 4 ways of knowing that he talks. And I am right now in, I would say, very early stages of learning. And where that has taken me, and I'll shut up after this, is in 2 or 3 different branches, which I see a starting point of Vervaeke's work, but definitely not the ending point. So the 3 or 4 branches I'm exploring is, one, I continue to explore Vervaeke's own exploration. He's gone deeper and deeper. For example, his recent work and conversations around AI, his recent work and conversations around um, internal family system and other psychological tools for managing that. So that's like me looking at Vervaeke's work now from a toolkit perspective. Like, what tools is he and practices is he exploring for meaning making? And there are 2 or 3 other branches which are completely outside of Vervaeke. One I'm intrigued by, and of course, I consider Ian McGilchrist as another one of that, right? In the pure secular tradition, I think I mentioned to you, I'm very influenced by David Deutsch and the 2 books he wrote. And one is called Fabric of Reality, and another is Beginning of Infinity. These are like, he's a physicist, philosopher, as hard-nosed and analytical, and he's really one of the significant brains since Turing in computational theory. We are not talking about lightweight academic. We're talking about somebody who's understands all aspects of reality. And his 2 books have been the most profound interpretation of the state of the art of the scientific view of reality and meaning making through that. So to me, what Vervaeke is saying is one branch, and what I am reading and studying is David Deutsch's second branch. And the third branch, which is metaphysical, is analytical idealism.
What was the last one? What idealism?
Analytical idealism.
Oh, idealism. Yeah, interesting.
This is Bernardo Strupa and others, right? They talk about why consciousness is a primary. There's a metaphysical debate. Informs a little bit about the meaning making, right? And then the final one, which is my latest one, and allows me to go back full circle to my roots, is Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta from Hindu spiritual tradition. right? And that is one mother lode of ideas that talk a lot about meaning making and spiritual quest. So I've gone on quite a bit, but what I'm saying to you is that where I am is that I'm enjoying these conversations as a frame, but I'm actually going down 3 or 4 streams and flowing down these streams. And these are parallel streams. I'm not looking to now start doing synthesis too quickly because they are so different. But I am sensing and I'm finding that eventually I will start having a mashup that makes sense to me.
Fascinating. That was really helpful. I mean, I really enjoyed that framing. Cam, do you want to go
Don't know I'm
next?
an advisor, but I'm definitely learning a lot by going down these rabbit holes.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're exploring. Cam, do you want to go next, or you want me to jump in?
Go ahead. I'll go
Okay.
last.
Um, yeah, I mean, my journey is pretty parallel to yours, Anurag. I mean, I'm actually doing a lot of practices and have for quite a while, and I am doing Vervaeke, Peterson, Miguel Christ primarily at the moment. Although I actually have that book you just mentioned. I just haven't read the whole thing about from Deutsch. So I'm trying to have as many intelligent perspectives as I can, or reasonable that I can muster. But I'm also I'm leaning more heavily now on that experiential participatory thing. And I'm really seeing, and that's just immense value in it, because I discover so much from practicing. And I'll give you an example that happened a couple of weeks ago that was really incredible. I don't think I've experienced this a few times, but it was amazing that I could do it, on the fly. So what happened was, I had, a weekend with my partner. We went up to the botanical garden in Sonoma, which she really wanted to do. I actually like it there too, but it was especially important to her to go. And I was not in a good place. And yeah, I think I was feeling resentful, is a good way to put it, or like life's unfair. And I was kind of irritated with her for certain things. And then somehow, and I don't quite know why, this was triggered, but I think it was triggered mostly because of my practices. I said to myself, and this is a Stoic practice, how would I feel about how I'm being today, the day I die, right? And did I say this to you, Anurag, before? I can't remember if I told. Oh, okay, good. And boy, did that have an effect, because what I got to see is I was being a real jerk, and that I was far from being at my best, and my orientation was not good. And so I really made an effort, but I also did it compassionately. I said, I can do better than this. Why don't I try to do a little better? And it worked, and it trended, and then we ended up having an incredible day, and then the weekend ended up being absolutely fantastic. And I felt the shift in me that was really helpful. And I was like, I really think this is what Vervaeke, Peterson, McGilchrist are talking about. I went from parasitical processing to a better place. I've been doing that really regularly. That one practice seemed to work so well. I keep saying it to myself is, in this moment, if I was to perceive myself, in my deathbed, what would I think about what I'm doing right now? It's quite helpful, because it makes me be my own witness through my own values. And it actually gives me a perspective that was thinking, yeah, if someone else was watching me right now and could see everything that was true about what I was doing, including my thought process, I would be pretty freaking embarrassed. Often, not always. Sometimes I say I'm doing fine, right? I'm good. I'm in a good groove, and I can feel it. Like I'm showing up in a way that matters. So, and that's a fairly new process that I've been applying, and that's very, very useful I think. I mean, I'm just really enjoying. I mean, what I'm enjoying is the results, and I think that this is, for me, this is the whole point of what we're doing here. For me, is that I want to embody certain ways of orientation, certain ways of being, as McGilchrist would say, or as Peterson said recently in a discussion with impact theory guy, Tom something or other. You know, God is not a propositional statement. It's a way of approaching life and a way of being that you use to interact and sort through what you're doing and what the world is like ongoing, right? So and what you're shooting for is the opposite of evil. I really like that model. He goes, you don't have to believe in good, but you know, do you believe evil exists? It's like, well, look at the Nazis. Is that good? Is there anything good about that? No. Okay, do the opposite. So I'm finding those frameworks really helpful in my life, and I'm hoping to expand upon that. And more than ever, I would hope to be able to enter into a I can't talk. Sorry, it's late. Participatory dynamic with others around those processes, to help encourage. I mean, because this is what people do in groups, right? Is they encourage each other towards a better outcome, right? Whether it's a therapy group or what we're doing, or you know, a religious group that's oriented properly. They're trying to help each other stay away from parasitic processing, and that's what I'm hoping to do for my life. So that's pretty much it.
Thank you for sharing. And first of all, I acknowledge that the Stoics got many of these psychotechnologies or techniques right, and they're very powerful. Especially, I think there's a word for it, memento mori or something like that, reflecting on death, or any of those. So I think many of the techniques you've talked about make a lot of sense, and they work. And they work.
Well, it was interesting to look up. I looked up, and there's a lot of traditions, even Christianity, that has a focus on the consequence of my behavior now from a perspective of death. It's not just right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a master class on this in Hindu spirituality.
Is there? Oh, it's interesting.
Oh my God, there's like 3,000 years, 4,000 years of ruminations on this subject. So I'm sure there are a lot of other religions talk about this. Cam.
Your turn, Cam.
Well, thanks you guys.
How are you translating this, and how does it work for you?
Well, so John Vervaeke specifically, there's two things in particular about him that are very helpful for me. One is he's very careful with the words that he uses, and not just the words, with the grammar. And he draws my conscious attention to that. And what I've noticed is that I don't know if I'm mimicking him, but I have noticed that my own patterns of speech have probably been affected by listening to him speak a lot.
Yep.
And the second thing that he does is he does gestural stuff in his presentations. And I find it quite profound. And I think I'm probably also starting to mimic that. And I don't know for sure if this is causal or not, but I do notice that in the interpersonal relationships that I participate in on a regular basis, I find myself now increasingly in a circumstance where there's rapt attention in the other participant or participants in what it is that I'm saying and doing as I'm presenting.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Oh.
Yeah, it's a little bit spooky, actually.
Are you not used to that?
Not like this. No, I'm not. It's yeah. So that, I think that's what's happening. Again, I honestly can't say if that's causal or not, but that would be my guess in trying to answer the question of what impact is Vervaeke's work specifically having on me. And then both of you guys, as I was listening to you, you said a couple of things, each of you did, that I wanted to relate to. So I share, Anu, the historical, I really like the way you said it. I can't remember it now. Aperture. You used the word aperture, I think, where you can see the telemetry of the cultural phenomena. I don't think I probably pay as close attention to what's going on in pop culture as the two of you two do when I listen to you. I just simply don't pay that much of attention to it. I know that there's some wacky stuff going on, but I don't. It's outside of my control, so I don't pay too much attention to it. Nonetheless, I also have, I'll say spooky again. Like I have this spooky sense that that's a projection. You remember how he talked about Paul projecting his own, I forget how he said it, but his own confusion onto God, I think.
Yep.
How he was thinking about God. And I have this experience. I like how you were saying, I knew like you can see the meaning making coming and going, the meaning crisis ebbing and flowing across great spans of time. And I'm like, yeah, it's happening every day for me. It's like I can feel it come and go every day. And I feel it at this phase of life, at 53 now, I guess. The reality of death, the reality of the end, it heaves into view. And I suspect that what I'm seeing in the macro, so that historical view, the weaving across time is happening. Like I'm starting to notice the same pattern over the course of my own life. And then even in my own day, it's like, here it comes. Cause for me, the practice is, typically the first half of the day, it's like I'm all about life and it's all meaningful and stuff. And then also fairly typically, by the time I get to late afternoon or evening, there starts to be a sense of hopelessness and some angst. Not always, but it's not an unusual circumstance. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is that rather than just be informed by that, for this one instance, start to participate in all of those arcs simultaneously. I feel like that's what's happening. So I don't feel so. I still feel a very powerful sense of individuation. I also find an increasing sense of communion, like with the two of you and with the other bodies around me. Like I don't even have to be talking with them or doing anything with them. They could be strangers. Like there's an increasing sense that, oh, that I am of that. We are of the same. And it's this same thread. In one of the EMP things they did when I went up to Bellingham last year, the first night out, one of the exercises they had us do is they had taken like, I don't know, several hundred yards of like probably 800 yards of parachute cord and run it through the trees in the woods, through the brush and through the trees and stuff. And then they put blindfolds on everybody and had them go one at a time. They would take you up and put your hand on the thread, and everybody went one at a time. And they had Kyle said a little poem at the beginning of it as everybody's getting ready to go. and in that poem, he's like, it's all about the thread. It's like you don't ever let go of that thread. And it was a very powerful experience. And you end at a fire pit, and then when everybody's there, they light the fire old school style, like with a bow drill, and they're singing songs and stuff. But anyway, that thread of meaning courses through all time, courses through today, courses through my life, courses through an entire civilization, the civilizations that it's coming out of, and I'm participating in that meaning making. Somewhere in one of these two lectures that we were just talking about, I think it was in one of these two, Vervaeke was describing, I think it was the scientific realization that nothing has any meaning. And for somebody like me, I have this powerful sense now. I'm like, that's great, because that means that it's all available to make meaning out of. And I get to do that with people like you.
Yeah,
which is enormously joyful.
that was helpful too. I mean, I'm glad that both of you talked about that, the perspective of cycles, because I did understand it, but I wasn't really focusing on it. And Anurag, both of you, I agree that that perspective actually does reduce my anxiety about what's happening, because it's not unusual, right? This is not, it's not, it's like someone that never lived through a full season of the world says it's cold. Oh my God, we're all going to die. No, that's just part of the cycle, right? It's, everything died and wilted and it's cold and what's happening? Well, that's kind of how a lot of us feel now, I think, right? There's like, we're in this cycle that's really disturbing, and we're seeing things wither and be smashed, and there's all this arguing, and there's all this conflict, and we have no idea if it's going to head up anytime soon or if it's going to head down to the depths of bullshit that we don't know yet. But it is part of life. And Enberg, I actually like what you said, is that it need not happen within our lifetime. And that's something that I think is really important to embrace as a potential. Right? I mean, it's because it might not. I mean, it might just go down to, stupidity beyond belief. I hope not, but it could be. So yeah, thank you both for that.
I will send a passage. I think Plato said something to the effect that how do you have a good life, or how do you operate when you are in a society that is collapsing, with everybody behaving like animals, and there is violence and there is no recourse to survival. All you do is you don't engage, you just stand aside from the crowd and just be yourself and be with a few people who you can love and be together with and have a good life and lead by example. That's it. Right.
Yeah.
So, and it's not necessarily a negative thing, it's a contextual thing, like depending upon, don't let it destroy you. You just step away and you do you, as they say, as my daughter says.
Is that what your daughter says?
Yeah.
All
Anyway,
right.
so I'm gonna stop the recording here.